and learning is key. So you're going to hear from Professor Spiridowicz and 3 graduate students who work in conservation at Queen's University. We have Eliza Contreras-Cigales, Victoria Cablis, and Michaela Marchuk, all of whom will be presenting their findings on artifact conservation to you. Would you all come up, please?
It's a little late to say good morning, but can everybody hear me? Yeah. So I'll provide a brief introduction as to how Queen's became involved with the Herstmonceux Project, and then the students will take over. The involvement of the art conservation program in the Herstmonceux Project began very informally in 2003 when I received a batch of recently excavated archaeological finds from the castle. They were hand-delivered by Dr. Brian Hunter, a chemistry professor from Queen's University, who taught regularly at Herstmonceux. Over the next 12 years, the treatment of the objects was completed by graduate students in the art conservation program. The artifacts consisted primarily of equestrian items such as decorative buckles and buttons from horse bridles, and a number of iron nails that dated to the 17th or early 18th century. Small plexiglass mounts were made by the students for some objects so that they could be easily displayed. Almost all of these artifacts have now been returned to the castle. In 2014, Dr. Scott McLean and Dr. Stephen Bednarski were awarded a multi-year partnership development grant from SSHRC to fund a much larger archaeological project. Thus, a more formal agreement was established between the Bader International Study Center and the Art Conservation Program at Queen's. Professor Amandina Anastasiadis took over the supervision of the artifact conservation stream on my retirement in the summer of 2014. The following summer, she visited the castle where she presented a series of lectures on preventive conservation to the graduate students from the field school. And she also provided advice on storage and exhibition of the artifacts. She returned to Canada with a small study collection of archaeological materials from the castle. These included organic materials, glass, and metals. Over the past 2 years, new items from the most recent excavations have been sent to Queen's for treatment. This arrangement benefits both institutions as it provides valuable opportunities for experiential learning for graduate students in the art conservation program, and it also ensures the long-term preservation of important medieval artifacts from Herstmonceux.
Like other professional fields, conservation has national, regional, and international governing bodies that develop guidelines for ethical practice and in some cases offer accreditation based on education and experience. In Canada, we have the CAC, the Canadian Association for Conservation, and around the world, some of the most widely known associations are AIC, the American Institute for Conservation of Historic and Artistic Works, and ICOMOS, the International Council on Monuments and Sites. Australia, Belgium, Brazil, New Zealand, and many other nations have similar professional associations with similar codes of ethics. Our professional code of ethics applies to every interaction between conservator and material culture. Conservators must think about using methods and materials that do not harm the object or its examination, treatment, or function. About respecting the object's physical, conceptual, historical, and aesthetic integrity. Also consider its intangible value. About recognizing his or her own limits in terms of education, competence, and resources, while recognizing the knowledge and skill of others. And about promoting an understanding of the field by talking with other professionals and the public about our efforts. This is a two-way street. We want to raise the profile of our work and be transparent about what we do. But we also want to collaborate with other disciplines and with the groups that have vested interest in a given material culture. By working together, we wish to avoid information loss and thus avoiding time loss. As we zero in on archaeological conservation, we'd like to start by talking a little about the physical context of buried artifacts. Archaeological objects have survived for centuries because they have reached an equilibrium with their environment. For example, a ceramic pot will degrade until enough layers have built above it to protect it from physical disturbances like water. Let's also remember stratigraphy. When we excavate, we consciously change the environment of the artifacts closest to us, but we're also changing the environment of the artifacts that remain underneath. The lower layers, the lower layers are changed as we remove the ones above, increasing their exposure to water, salt, oxygen, weight of people and equipment, among other factors. If left uncontrolled, these factors can destroy the equilibrium objects have reached with their respective burial environments.
Once objects are removed from the soil, they can start to deteriorate very rapidly. For example, this iron object was whole when it was excavated, but developed active and aggressive corrosion 6 months almost immediately afterwards. 6 months later, without any conservation intervention, the artifact disintegrated and was effectively lost. Continued degradation is often caused by the new environmental conditions the artifacts are exposed to, such as differing levels of humidity and temperature. This can occur, for example, in a fines processing lab or in a storage area. There are additional factors that can have an impact on the preservation of archaeological artifacts. These include physical damage, theft and vandalism, pollutants, light, fire, and pests.
We will now turn to the work that has been carried out in the Masters of Art Conservation program at Queen's on the artifacts from Herstmonceux. Thank you. There are two main methods through which we analyze Herstmonceux objects: destructive analysis and non-destructive analysis. Firstly, we have destructive analysis. Here, samples are taken from an object and examined under the microscope. Analytical technology includes stereomicroscopy, plane polarized and cross-polarized light microscopy, cross-sections where the sample is embedded in resin, and microchemical analysis. Secondly, we have non-destructive analysis. Here's a short list of the non-destructive techniques we regularly employ: X-ray fluorescence, X-ray diffraction, scanning electron microscopy, dispersive energy spectroscopy, gas chromatography, mass spectroscopy, Fourier transform infrared spectrometry. As graduate students at Queen's, we are fortunate to have access to all forms of these analysis. We will now focus on 3 analytical techniques that we frequently use to analyze Herstmonceux artifacts: X-ray fluorescence, X-radiography, and microscopy. XRF is a surface technique which can tell us about the elemental makeup of an inorganic object surface. We use it extensively in our work with Herstmonceux objects, as we predominantly deal with metal objects, which of course are inorganic. Our common dealings with metal excavated objects is likely because these objects seem to endure the burial environment at Herstmonceux quite well. Regardless, as you can see from the figure on the slide, the burial environment still takes its toll on the objects we receive, which can make identification difficult. The archaeologists brought the decorative closure to the MAC program for treatment and analysis. As the object displayed evidence of what appeared to be gilding, we were able to confirm the presence of gold in addition to arsenic, possibly a component of the gold mixture itself, through the use of XRF. The gold leaf is so fragile, this information not only greatly changes our treatment approach, but adds to the information for archaeological record. X-radiography is particularly useful to us when we have a metal object that is hidden by a disfiguring layer of soil and corrosion, which is often the case of Herstmonceux objects that we receive in our lab. X-radiography, or X-rays, do not only allow us to see what lies under the surface. We can manipulate manipulate the exposure time of radiographs to see specific details of interest to us, such as where the metal surface now lies under layers of erosion. After years spent in a burial environment, the original surface of metal objects will become mineralized and no longer resemble metal. In the above radiographs, we hope to determine how much the original surface of the buckles had mineralized. We do not want to scrape away the original surface during treatment, so X-radiography was particularly important during our treatment of the Herstmonceux buckles.
Microscopy allows us to see many things that we cannot see with the naked eye, and we work at different magnifications ranging anywhere from 10 times to 400 times. The use of plane polarized and cross polarized light microscopy are techniques that we employ to identify materials by showing us how that material interacts with the plane polarized and cross polarized light. In plane polarized light microscopy, light goes through a filter, which allows only waves of a single plane to pass through. And if you use these two filters and place them perpendicular to one another, no light can pass through. Certain materials interact with light, allowing light to pass through, and depending on the density of these materials, they will bend the light that goes through them. If you place such a material between two polarizing light filters that are perpendicular to one another, creating cross-polarized light, some of the light can pass through because it was bent by the material. The ways in which materials do this is characteristic of that material, and we can use this to identify it. In the case of ceramic vessel HARC BTF.1.0, examination of the sample under plane polarized and cross polarized light was able to tell us about the microstructure and composition of the materials used in its manufacture. For example, it was able to tell us that the inclusions seen are polymineralic. As you can see on the slide, they vary in interference and radiation or retardation colors. Since tempered particles are often polymineralic in nature, this may confirm the inclusions addition as part of the temper recipe. Furthermore, since tempered particles are often angular rather than rounded from erosion and weathering processes experienced by clay itself, this may also confirm that the inclusions were added intentionally as part of the temper to the clay mixture. Interference and retardation colors of inclusion number 3 indicated the presence of quartz, which we were also able to corroborate using XRD or X-ray diffraction. Lastly, the diagonal orientation of the non-plastic polymineralic inclusions is characteristic of wheel-thrown vessels. We aim to stabilize the objects we receive without introducing too many new materials. For example, we aim to keep the work we do, such as repairs or infills, obvious to those who will be working and studying these pieces in the future. We aim to provide long-term storage and support solutions for objects returning to the castle, and when fabricating these storage containers and supports, we take into consideration the environment, which includes humidity and temperature, and other on-site resources. Lastly, in both the conservation of the objects themselves and in the fabrication of the supports, we try and tailor our approach based on the consideration of future use and context, which in part is being developed through this symposium.
We have mentioned stabilization as part of our approach, but there are other steps that make up a conservation treatment. These are some of the techniques that we use in the conservation of Herstmonceux objects. Mechanical cleaning means reducing soil residues or disfiguring layers accumulated on an object surface by using sable brushes, bamboo skewers, and metal tools. We often complete this step under a microscope. Reconstruction entails more than putting an object together from an assortment of pieces. Conservators consider variables such as the appropriateness of an adhesive over another in terms of strength of both adhesive and object, how easy it is to apply or to reduce if necessary, and how it will behave in a given environment. Stabilization means to reduce the rate of immediate deterioration of an object. How can we slow down or even halt the fragmentation of a crumbling surface, for example? Electrolytic reduction is a technique specific to metals, often used on corroded wrought iron objects. We construct an electrolytic cell in which the object acts as the cathode and an uncorroded metal coupon acts as the anode. With the addition of an electrolytic solution and external electrical current, some of the metal in the object that has formed corrosion will be reduced to uncorroded metal. Corrosion inhibition is also a metal conservation technique. After we have clarified the surface of the corroded metal, we want to reduce the risk of future corrosion outbreaks. We do this by artificially creating a passive layer of corrosion on the object, a layer that is both unintrusive and stable, meaning that it does not attack further the metal core of an object. We have applied tannic acid to wrought iron objects and benzotriazole, or BTA, to copper and copper alloy objects as corrosion inhibitors. We also apply coatings to Herstmonceux objects because they will be used for study purposes. Some of the steps outlined in the previous slide were completed in the treatment of these copper alloy buckles, specifically mechanical cleaning, followed by the application of BTA as a corrosion inhibitor. Because BTA is under scrutiny for its possible carcinogenic effects, the buckles were then coated with a resin called Paraloid B48N that acts as a protective barrier for potential BTA transfers onto surfaces. The treatment of these buckles was completed by three different students. Part of this exercise was to research and decide on a common treatment path. We did this to achieve cohesiveness in our approach and to work towards dependable, repeatable ways in which to treat Herstmonceux objects. We also decided on a common way to make the boxes for the buckles. These were made with simple design and easy handling in mind. We chose the white plastic coroplast over the paper-based glue board because coroplast provides increased protection against physical damage during transportation and storage, as well as mitigates the risk of degradation arising from emergencies such as flooding.
Ceramic vessel H-Arc ETF.1.0 came to us in 36 pieces and had a very friable, which means soft and powdery surface. This made handling quite a challenge. The object was examined and treated by a current student in the Master of Art Conservation program. The treatment approach for this object was guided by its future use in context. The ceramic vessel was washed and consolidated, so essentially impregnated with an adhesive, to prevent loss, and the pieces were then reassembled. Areas of structural weakness, where there were significant gaps in the joins, were filled using a material that was selected based on its suitability. Criteria for suitability included the strength of the adhesive relative to that of the clay body. Infills were made in 2 areas and were inpainted so that they were not visually obtrusive, but still remained salient and were easily differentiated from the existing original material. While other gaps remain, we wanted to ensure that our intervention was minimal. Our aim was to make this piece safe to handle and to study.
We would like to share with fellow students in the audience who may be traveling to Herstmonceux to participate in excavations some guidelines for handling and packing freshly excavated artifacts in the field, as preventative conservation plays an important role in every stage of an archaeological excavation. By working together, we can ensure the long-term preservation of material culture for present and future generations to study and enjoy. So more handling equals a greater risk of damage. Keep wet materials wet and dry materials dry. Use specific labels and transparent packaging. Store different materials separately. Do not overfill bags. Do not put heavy objects on top of light ones. Provide support for fragile objects. Use padding to minimize shock and abrasion. And always remember that temporary packing may end up as long-term storage. For further information on conservation practices, please refer to the resources on this slide.
We hope this talk has showed you the enthusiasm we bring to our work with the archaeological collection of Herstmonceux. For the moment, we treat objects and provide them with storage systems based on limited information on their future environment and context. We believe our participation in this project can be greatly improved by a close communication with the people who care for the collection, including collection managers, historians, and archaeologists. From our end, we want to develop protocols that will systematize our approach to conserving Herstmonceux pieces, but we want to do this in collaboration with partners on the other end in order to create and maintain protocols that make sense for everybody. Looking at the ways in which we can grow together, we would like to see conservation students at the Herstmonceux Castle one day. We close by quoting William Morta, the former first keeper of the National Register of Historic Places. It has been said that, at its best, preservation engages the past in a conversation with the present over a mutual concern for the future. Thank you very much.